Alright, here we go again. So on the last slide I was running out right at the end. I'm trying to keep these below 12 minutes because I know I can post 12 minutes on YouTube. Anything over that, I'm not sure. I might be able to go to 15, but anyway. So I kind of was at a bit of a rush there, so let me kind of go back and recap. Since I recorded the last video, though, I did go back and check a little bit about Harding. I got curious. I mentioned that he had gone to Alaska on a trip. I told you there was a legend in Alaska that maybe his wife might have poisoned him. And I told you he got food poisoning, which he probably did. But he did actually die back in the United States. I think it said San Francisco, and they're not sure if it was a stroke or a heart attack. They're thinking maybe a heart attack. But anyway, then thought I would clarify that since I had a minute to go check into it. But what I was telling you about was the election of 1924. I told you that Harding decided to run for election to president. He was already president because he had assumed the job when Harding had died. And I mentioned, so he is very Republican. I mentioned that the Democratic Party was, very disorganized and a lot of internal strife at this time. I told you they eventually ended up with a guy named John W. Davis. Okay? And it took like over 100 roll call votes to get Davis nominated. The Democrats couldn't consolidate around one candidate, which shows that there's a lot of disunion in the party. So I didn't get a chance to get into this in the last video because I was running out of time. So this is as good a time to talk about it as any. So one of the things that was causing strife in the Democratic Party at the time was the arrival or the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, we met the Ku Klux Klan earlier in the class back in Reconstruction. That was a different version of the Klan. That was, I like to say that's Ku Klux Klan 1.0. They rode around at night, they terrorized freedmen, they committed atrocities, and tried to fight Reconstruction. And officially the group had been disbanded, although they never really quite went away. Well, around this time in the 1920s, there was a resurgence of the Klan. Okay? It's a slightly different version of it. Okay? This Klan is the more open Klan, whereas the previous Klan did a lot under cover of night and was a little more secretive. This one is where you see people wearing white robes. They might have Klan Day at the fair, and a bunch of people show up wearing, Klan uniforms. Okay, white robes with pointed dunce hats. Okay? So it's a different version of the Klan. Okay? It's a little more open. Okay? It's a little more politically involved. Okay? Now there is violence associated with this Klan as well. Okay? But it was seen as a lot of business leaders, or this is mostly the South, of course. There were a lot of people who were involved with the Klan. Okay? So it's a different version. It's Klan 2.0. They've recycled the name, but it has a little bit different thing going on here. And I like to joke, because if you can't joke about the Ku Klux Klan, who can you joke about? That the original Klan, of course, was a lot more myopic. They basically hated blacks and the occasional carpetbagger or scallywag. But the new Klan is much more open-minded. They hate a much wider variation of people. They still hate blacks, but they also hate Catholics, Jews, and foreigners. Okay? They're very much anti-immigrant. I will get into that a little later in the slides. And so it's a different kind of beast. And this is where you see a lot of pictures from this time era. Like I said, they'll have the Labor Day parade or the 4th of July parade, and here comes the local contingent of the Klan marching in their fine white uniforms. So it's not quite as secretive. It's a more open organization. But behind the scenes, there's still a lot of secretive shenanigans going on, and there's still violence involved in this too. Okay? And they're at a peak in power at this time in 1924. And so, of course, the Southern Democrats, A lot of them were affiliated with the Klan. I'm not saying all of them, but the Klan would try to pick candidates and influence things, and they very much saw themselves as standing up for the American way. And so I was looking over a little bit about the 1924 Democratic Convention just before I came on the speaker here. I was talking about, of course, the Southern Democrats tended to support one group of candidates, the Northern the other. And so there's a lot of disunion in the Democratic Party right now. Like I said, so John W. Davis is not a strongly supported candidate. Then out of this ruckus, okay, we see the reemergence of the Progressive Party. Now, the Progressive Party, of course, had lost in 1912 with Roosevelt. In 1916, Roosevelt, tried to kind of revitalize the Republican Party by kind of going back into the fold. The Progressive Party, without his leadership, kind of folded. It went away. But in 1924, they reappear with Robert La Follette, who was in the Progressive Lecture number 6. He's associated with Wisconsin. And so the progressives are kind of looking at, well, gosh, we got the Republican Party's been mired in this Teapot Dome scandal and other scandals. The Democrats are disunified. The Klan's trying to, back certain candidates. And so the progressives are kind of like a pox on both your houses. Let's try it again. And so they'll run Robert La Follette. Okay. Here's your results here. Here's your election map. So Coolidge gets more than 50% of the popular vote, so he's done pretty well, considering he's only, but he was an accidental president. He's in blue. Davis can really only win the South, the solid South shown here in red. And you'll notice up there in green, Robert La Follette has won Wisconsin, which was his home state. Now, you'll notice the progressives got 16.5% of the popular vote, which isn't too bad for a third party, but, there's a name for a group that gets 16% of the vote. Of course, that's the loser. Okay, so Coolidge will get an actual term of his own instead of, before he was just filling out Harding's term. Now he's got his own term to work with. Here's Coolidge wearing a mourning band. I'm not sure why. He's in mourning for somebody. Right. So during this time in 1920s, we'll talk more about the economy in the next lecture. The Republican Party has very pro-business policies at this time. They passed the Fordney-McCumber tariff. I don't need you to know the specifics about this. As I told you, I'm getting kind of sick of talking about tariffs. Just remember that the Republican Party has always favored, at least at the time, had always favored protective tariffs to protect American industry. This goes back to their founding in 1854. They also supported tax reduction. Taxes get raised, to pay for all these progressive programs. Of course, they get raised in the war to cover the war costs. And in the 20s, the Republicans think the money should go back to the taxpayers because then they can use things to stimulate the economy and buy stuff. The Secretary of the Treasury at the time is a guy named Andrew Mellon. I've got a picture of him here. Okay. Mellon was a rich industrialist. I believe he was associated with aluminum, if I recall, but I could be incorrect on that. Okay. And it basically comes down to promotion of business and industry. The Republicans, we went through this gilded age where there was very little control on business. Then you went through the progressive era where they were trying to regulate business, strongly. Now the 1920s, they don't necessarily try to roll back all of the regulation, but they're trying to do things to encourage businesses. And it's really pretty simple. If businesses are doing well, they hire people. If people have jobs, then they spend money. If they spend money, that helps other businesses, and then taxes are collected. So the whole idea is that the money can do more out of the economy than it can if the government just takes it. This is one of the ideological differences that splits the parties nowadays. Democrats would like to see, in general, I'm speaking in general terms, like to see more more taxes, where the government can do more things with it, and Republicans, in general, think that the public can do better with that money by buying things, stimulating growth. It's a basic ideological difference between the parties, and yes, I've greatly oversimplified it for the sake of the lecture. Just know that during this time frame, Republicans, like I said, are actively trying to, get business to do well. Like I said, we'll talk more about that in lecture 9.